This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. In this episode, I think I'm going to recount my research article on the death of George Washington, which I find to be one of the more spectacular episodes in American history. When I first ran into the fact that George Washington was bled to death by his doctors, I was genuinely shocked. I was shocked not just by the details of the case, but also by the fact that I'd never really heard this before. It seemed very strange to me. I couldn't understand it. So I just kept reading about it and thinking, my goodness, this man was killed by his doctors that bled 5 pints of blood, half the blood in his body, then gave him an enema, and then he expired at a relatively young age. He should have been alive for another 20 years, as people of his social status and everything were at that time. And it seems incredible that the father of our country, the most revered man in America, about whom there's absolutely no dispute, who should be president after the Constitution was drafted, would have been killed by his doctors through bleeding, a hideous, horrible practice that was very common from the Middle Ages all the way up through the 19th century. So I was concerned about writing about it because I thought, well, everybody must know this, and I must be uniquely shocked. I guess maybe I'd been protected from this information or overlooked this in middle school history or something. I didn't know what was going on. So I began to ask around, hey, did you know George Washington, father of our country, was killed by his own doctors? They bled him to death, bled half the blood out of his body, and then gave him an enema, and he expired. And I couldn't find a single person with whom I spoke who told me that they knew that. They're really? I didn't know this. That's amazing. So in light of that, and in light of the fact that I've been writing a lot about what's called iatrogenic death, which is death by doctors, a big feature of our time, death at the hands of the medical profession itself, death at the hands of the experts, death at the hands of the know-it-alls, the healers come to save you and actually kill you. This is a very common feature of our times. I thought, well, I'm just going to write about it. So I did. Well, the article appeared first on Brownstone, and then Robert Malone republished it and got tons of traffic in both places. And then Epoch Times just published it. So it's making the rounds. And now everywhere I go, I'm hearing about this article constantly. So it seems like it really did resonate with a lot of people, much to my amazement. So look, this cries out for an answer. Like, how is it that something as well known and reported by all historians, even from the earliest age, would be so strangely unknown in terms of popular culture? And I think it has something to do with the status of the medical profession for a very long time in this country and around the world, if not throughout since the ancient world. We've just had this reverence for medical protocols. If you follow them and then die, then at least you're to be congratulated for following the protocols. In fact, there's a funny scene in Oscar Wilde's play called The Importance of Being in Earnest, where Algernon, who had made up his fake friend named Bunbury, who he had to go to the city to visit all the time, or the country, I forget now, one of the two. It's a complicated story. Anyway, he decides to kill off Bunbury for various reasons having to do with the plot, and reports this to his aunt Agatha, who says, so he says, well, look, Bunbury is dead. And she said, well, that's shocking to hear. How did that happen? And he says, well, his doctors discovered that Bunbury couldn't live, so therefore Bunbury died. And Aunt Agatha says, well, he certainly shows a great deal of confidence in his physician's advice. And then follows up with, at least he made a decisive judgment for once in his life and was following the appropriate advice of his doctor. So it's a great It's a great line and written during the Victorian age, but really a very subtle attack on the way culture tends to regard the advice of doctors as somehow sacrosanct, even when it kills you. So anyway, let's go through the details of the case of George Washington. He was of course born. Let's see, I have it here in 1732. Died 1799. More than a decade after the Constitution was ratified. He'd come in from a tour of his lands over several days during bad weather. Came down with a throat infection. Suffered from it most of the night. Didn't know what to do, and summoned his doctors. But before his doctors got there, he had a servant come in, and he asked the servant to bleed him. So yes, it's true. Washington had suggested this as the answer because everybody sort of believed in bleeding. It was a consequence of a humoral theory of disease that bad humor is inside of you and bleeding will get it out of you. I still, it's just hard to conceptualize how a man as intelligent and wise and experienced as George Washington would believe this. How come he couldn't think his way around these protocols or see the obvious point? I mean, his whole life as a general, he had seen countless men on the battlefield die from bleeding. You get shot and you bleed to death, not from the bullet, but just from the loss of blood. I mean, he surely would have known this, but even a man as intelligent and far-seeing as George Washington couldn't see his way around the established protocols, the best practices of the profession of doctors at that time. So he asked to be bled. And really wanted a deep wound. And so out it came. The doctor arrived the next morning and said, well, that's exactly the right thing. You did exactly the right thing. You bled him. Let's bleed him some more, bled him some more. And another doctor arrived. He had access to the best doctors, obviously. And another doctor. And then yet another doctor arrived, and all three of them participated. And by the time it was all over, he had 5 pints of blood drained from him, half of his body, half the blood in his body, which would kill anyone. If you lost half your blood, you'd be dead. And then they gave him an enema and he expired. And that was it. So killed by his doctors, George Washington, there's no question about it. Turned a throat infection into death. So I began to go through so those are the facts. That's just what happened, and they're not in any dispute. But I began to wonder if the biographers had changed the judgment from George Washington's time to our own time. So I just began to read some of the biographies. I didn't read them all; that would be impossible. But I read what I could to prepare the article. And the very first biography came out pretty quickly. It was by this future Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, whose biography was published in 8 volumes from 1804 to 1807. And when it came time, which I think this volume would have been published as late as 1807, it just says, plainly, it says, believing bloodletting to be necessary, he procured a bleeder who took from his arm 12 or 14 ounces of blood, but would not permit a messenger to be dispatched for his family physician until the appearance the next day. And at about 11 in the morning, the doctor arrived and took the rest. So here's the quote, the utmost exertions of medical skill were applied. But despite them, so they were applied in vain, despite these applications of medical skill, the powers of life were manifestly yielding to the forces of disorder, and it became breathing became impractical, and then he just died, and without a struggle. Brave death, right? So you hear the language here already. Believing bloodletting to be necessary, despite the utmost exertions of medical skill, he died. So clearly, in 1807, there was still a belief that this was the right thing to do. Now, that began to change. But you see what's happening here is like medical skill and protocols, best practices, standards of care, followed by death. No one knows why, just yielding to the forces of disorder, despite the best application of medical skill. So that's it. That set the tone. That set the tone that George Washington was brave. He could afford the best medical care. He got the best medical care. He died despite that care, not because of it. And that set the tone. That was the very first biography, the biography that everybody read for the whole of the 19th century. Now, during that time, by the second half of the 19th century, it was as late as that people began that the wisdom about bleeding began to change, and the official view shifted, in part because of criticisms from the homeopaths and others who were looking at the conventional medicine, saying, "You people out of your mind! You can't drain the actual life out of them and expect them to get better. No, they were going to get worse and die." They called this practice of bleeding, they called it phlebotomy. Phlebotomy. That just means blood's drained. We're taking the blood out of you. That's all that means. It's a fancy medical word meaning we're going to kill you. So it was still practiced as late as the middle of the 19th century. And then it began to change over the coming decades. By the end of the 19th century, bloodletting was no longer considered to be part of the best practices, but what became to be repudiated and disputed and considered to be stupid. So a 1917 kid's book that I found by Callista McCabe Courtney just sums it up this way. She says, "Before the morning of the third day, he was very ill, and when the doctors came, they bled him. It was the stupid practice of those days. And in a few hours, Washington was so weakened, he passed the hope of recovery, so he died." So that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, there was a stupid practice, but you notice the absence of judgment, the absence of outrage, just a kind of, well, those are the best practices, considered to be the best practices in those days. So of course that's why he died, and that's entirely. The implications. Yeah, it was stupid, but it wasn't murder. It wasn't horrifying. George Washington wasn't killed by his doctors. It was a dumb practice. It was just like a lot of medicines, just a regrettable thing that happened. So, I concluded that even after the practice of phlebotomy or bleeding, death by bleeding, stopped, just the retrospective judgment never became severe. It never became like condemnation of all the people who died from bleeding through the ages. The most recent biography, and the most celebrated one, I got a Pulitzer Prize or whatever, was by Ron Chernow, and it's very good. Says something very similar. He recounts all the details, complete with the enema. And this is a very, very good biography, and then just says that very similarly, that they believed in bleeding, and he died from it. But again, the Chernow biography just treats it as a kind of tragedy of the time. Just something that happens with bad doctor's advice, and that was it. But no outrage, no shock, no alarm, no real lessons. I guess my feeling is that if the father of your country, the founding father of your country, the first president, the most revered man in American history, but by far, was killed by his doctors, the actual lesson should have been, once the wisdom surrounding bleeding had changed by the 1850s, the lesson should have been something like, there should have been a war on iatrogenocide, right? There should have been a war, a national focus on stopping death by doctors. Something like that. There should have been outrage. Instead, there wasn't. The practice continued. I mean, after that, we had the continuation of these kinds of things. We shouldn't forget that by the time bleeding was considered disreputable, we had all sorts of other terrible things that were being introduced into medicines, ultimately resulting in kind of mass poisoning by mercury, for example. I was watching a Marx Brothers movie the other day called Horse Feathers, and there was a joke in it. It was like a pun based on Camel cigarettes and aspirins, and he made a reference to a cure for headaches called I think it's called caramel. I think is what it was called. And I thought, well, that's strange. I wonder what that is. This would have been 1932. This movie was made. And Chico was saying, "Oh, what if I get a headache? I take a caramel." And so I looked it up. Well, it turns out to be a mercury. So you had people consuming mercury. It's like a poison. It's an absolute poison. So this was as late as 1922. So hardly unusual. And during that same period, don't forget, we had lobotomies that were very common at the time. Those lobotomies came about as a method of sedating people that became common in the 1930s, throughout the 40s and the 50s, and was later replaced by psych drugs, which have been advertised as cures for mental illness, but are clearly just a form of chemical lobotomy, just a way of sedating patients, advertised as cures. So hardly anything unusual. And in this context and in these times, it's impossible not to look into very recent history, which takes us back to March 2020, when it was just assumed, like for no apparent reason that I can figure out, that with the coronavirus coming to the US and with cases rising, that there would be a mass new demand for ventilators. So people would have to be intubated. It's just assumed by the government, medical professionals, military, everybody. Well, we're going to have a demand for tens of thousands of intubation patients. We're going to need ventilators. So Trump in those days even issued a Defense Authorization Act, and like basically a central planning mandate on industrial mandate for General Motors and others to produce more ventilators, because it's just assumed that we're going to have to ventilate people. Now, and in the early days, I mean, it's just an incredible history to recount, and to think it was just recently. I mean, the entire administration was in a scramble to have ventilators. Trump is on the phone with mayors and governors. How many ventilators do you think you'll need? We're going to have football fields of people being ventilated, but no evidence, no understanding, no actual consultation with doctors on the ground. What do you do in the case of respiratory infection? Ventilation is something you use only in extreme emergencies because it's more than likely to kill you. It's not a mystery. Everybody knows this. Your lungs don't really survive being ventilated like that. And sure enough, most people, overwhelming numbers, 70, 80, 90% of people die from ventilation. And yet it was assumed to be that's what we're going to have to do. So sure enough, in New York, at the very height of things, it was really the only place where it got really, really intense very early on. Patients were immediately stuck on ventilators. Part of the reason for the ventilation, I'm sorry to say, is that people thought it was safer, because if if COVID was spread through breathing out, they didn't want COVID patients breathing out. They wanted them to breathe into a machine that would breathe back into them and therefore keep the air clean. So basically they were killed. And the question is, how many people died? And, there's really no way to know that, but it could be in the tens of thousands of people that were killed in this country from ventilation, intubation, unnecessary ventilation. And at that same time, let's not forget that the best medical advice was not to use known therapeutics like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Don't use them, but rather wait for the vaccine. Now, so what that meant was that you could not get ivermectin in many parts of this country. I happen to live in one of those parts of the country. Some places you could get it, but in most parts of the country, many parts of the country, you could not get it. Certainly not from Walgreens, certainly not from CVS, and not even usually from your family-owned pharmacy, the very few that are left that are not taken over by private equity, because the mandate came down from HHS and CDC and elsewhere to not distribute ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And there are all sorts of fake studies that were being generated to back up this campaign. And the CDC sent out a meme that said, don't take, you're not a horse, don't take horse paste, just get your vaccine. So everything was taken off the shelf. So countless numbers of people died because they didn't have basic antivirals that you could get at the store, even if you showed up with the prescription, as what happened to me. I showed up to the pharmacy with a prescription for ivermectin, and the girl at the counter said, "Excuse me one moment," went back to the guy in the back. I was watching through the window. He shook his head no. And the no wasn't, "We don't have any." The no was, "No, we're not going to distribute that here." So there was definitely a mandate. It came down. So I guess the reason I'm retelling all this stuff is just to recount that it's very easy to look back at the history of medicine and say, "Oh, look at all the dumb things they used to do," from tonsillectomies to goodness knows what else. They were so dumb. They were so brutal. They were so ignorant. We, on the other hand, are so smart. We know all things. We have all the latest literature. We don't actually know what in the future the medical profession is going to say about the current protocols and practices. Maybe they'll all be repudiated. Right now, we have, the number of shots given to children in the called vaccines, even though most of them are not vaccines by any historical standard, are in the 70s. And we wonder why the children are sick. We wonder about the autism epidemic. We wonder why so many people are cursed with physical problems and allergies. But somehow there's a taboo against questioning these vaccines. In fact, this video, just by saying what I just now said, will be threatened with a takedown from YouTube. And for during the years of COVID, it absolutely could never have been put on YouTube. It might make it through now because they've loosened up things a little bit, but already some people who would have shared this video because they want to learn about the history of George Washington having been killed by his doctors won't share it precisely because of what I just now said. That's how taboo it is. But is it going to be taboo in 10 years and 20 years? Are we going to look back at these times and say, these people were out of their minds? They indemnified an entire industry in 1986 against any kind of liability, only because they begged the government to do this, because otherwise they claimed that they would have gone out of business. I can't, and that created a gold rush, and they sacrificed several generations of children in the name of pharmaceutical profits, and never gave the victims any kind of chance to use the court system to achieve justice for their vaccine injury. Are we going to look back in shock and horror in the same way we look back at George Washington's death and amazement and astonishment at the ignorance and stupidity and brutality of the bleeding practice? It's very possible. Or will we do what we've done with George Washington and go, well, those are the best practices they had at the time. After all, as long as you're sincere, as long as it's being done by credentialed doctors according to the best protocols, then nobody's to blame. Everything's fine. Iatrogenic death, it's regrettable, but it's the price you have to pay for having a modernized, credentialed, and highly professional medical corps taking care of our people. Is that what we're going to do? Probably. I'm just guessing that will probably be the result. Very tragic and very strange. Well, that's my message for today. Thank you so much for listening. And I think the lesson, if I wanted to wrap this up, what would it be? It'd be something like question medical authority. Question medical authority. Many people are. I go to a lot of conferences around the country. Everybody's rethinking allopathic medicine, rethinking the whole thing, including many, many doctors. And I think rightly so. We need a new approach to healing this country. The death of George Washington should have made America the home of genuine science-based medical innovations and evidence-based healings methods. Instead, it's just mostly just been covered up. Maybe in the next generation, we will learn and will change. Thank you very much.